is continue. For the first quiz, I've only graded half of them because I'm a terrible person, but it doesn't take that long. So God forbid, I'll grade them tomorrow. I'll finish grading them tomorrow. Thing is, I won't decide on a curve until I finish grading them. So if you have a lower score than you like, I mean, we all have disappointments in life, but understand that after I see all the grades together, I might well curve it. Um, okay. Um, Dunnicks. Dunnicks have been really well studied because um, they they have a very flexible mating system, as actually a lot of birds do. There are examples of monogamy, polygyny, a single male with multiple females breeding on a single territory, polyandry, a single female with an alpha and a beta male on a single territory, both feeding the young, polygynandry, multiple males and breeding males and females with overlapping territories. We'll see. It may not be as bad as you think, or it might, right? So it wasn't very many questions, but it had a bunch of multiple answer questions, which are harder. So yeah. Um, anyway, um, there you go. And heritability is a challenging sort of mentally tongue twistery concept because it's really just designed to show how fast can a trait evolve within a single environment. Um, okay, so Dunix, one question is why are there territories with both alpha and beta males? Um, the first thing that this was research done by Nick Davies at Oxford with colleagues is they had to carefully figure out, and these were done at the beginning of DNA fingerprinting, who's getting to fertilize whose eggs. Um, that's the one of the nice things about Blackboard is multiple answer quizzes. So it's an interesting mating system with these Dunnicks. Um, Basically, males, whoever gets to spend more time near the female gets to fertilize more offspring. So um, the alpha male is defined by sort of behavioral dominance. When the alpha male chases away the beta male runs away and not the other way. Um, but there are times when the beta male is the only bird close to the female on that territory. And the more time the beta male has access to the female, the higher proportion of offspring that they sire, right? So in general, when you fit a line to this data, it looks, you know, something like this. Now, what's interesting is the higher proportion of mating access that the beta male has with the female, the higher proportion of food deliveries are carried out by that male. So basically, the birds are very responsive. They can recognize their own offspring, that those were different experiments, but the more time they got to spend with the female, the more effort they put into helping rear those chicks. So the females, at least from a fitness standpoint, definitely benefit from basically juggling the attention of more than one male in order to get more feedings and higher survival for their chicks. Um, And this is a system where, um, the more um, males in on a territory, um, the larger number of young raised per year for both, in this case, I think for both males and females. So if you have a monogamous pair, they can rear about 5.5 chicks on average. Um, but if you have two males um, on a single female's territory, they can rear more chicks, which is kind of interesting. And if you have two females on a single male territory, they're going to rear fewer chicks. So, um, why be polyandrous? And so the question is, are there costs to the female um, for basically spending time with the beta male? And it's possible that the female is going to lose paternal care from the alpha male if she spends more time with the beta. Um, but there are benefits, which is additional, more paternal care, perhaps access to territories for foraging for the female. So females will sometimes spend time with neighboring males, and when they do that, they don't get harassed when they forage for food outside of their territory. A female may be looking for good genes, so she might want to mate with a male that can produce attractive offspring. And there's also just an insurance policy. If you mate with multiple males, the odds that at least one of them has, sort of good functioning sperm so that your eggs actually hatch is higher. So why not be polyandrous? And this has actually been studied more in primates, that in a comparative study of many different primate species, the degree of polyandry, so the number of males that females mate with on average, is positively correlated with white blood cell count. So the argument from this study is that females mating with multiple males are going to be under immune stress. And that could be a result of, just sort of cortisol stress, or it could be a result of actually like exposure to more infections. In terms of good genes, um, in blue throats, um, they looked at the strength of the immune response that chicks could mount. So this wing swelling, um, what you do is you jab a tiny bit of a foreign protein like rabbit immunoglobulin into the wing. It's not going to poison the bird, but it's going to stimulate an inflammatory response, which is an immune response. Greater swelling means stronger immune response. And there are lots of studies, showing that, birds under nutritional stress, animals in, worse nutritional condition, are not able to mount as strong an immune response. And what they found in the blue throats was that the extra pair young, that's what EPW stands for, extra pair young, were able to mount a higher immune response than the within pair young. And so this is taken as evidence that females are mating with males with especially good genes that allow them to fight disease well, potentially. The other possible benefit is that you can mate with, if you mate with an attractive male, then those genes will be passed on to your offspring and you'll produce um, more attractive, um, more attractive offspring. And this was seen when comparing the mating success of the offsprings of singing versus non-singing males in field crickets. Okay, so a lot of the thinking about flexible mating systems um, started with Gordon Orion's polygyny threshold model, basically just the idea that females should switch mating systems from monogamy to polygyny or polyandry when the benefits exceed the costs. So for Orion's, what he was predicting was if a male has an especially high quality territory, then there's going to be some threshold where that territory is so good that being the second female on a territory, getting less paternal care but access to really good resources or maybe really good genes makes it, can surpass a threshold where it's in the female's interest to be the second female on a territory. So that was the prediction in birds, and it's been studied and sometimes supported. And this model was tested by, human behavioral ecologists, trying to see whether the prediction could be matched for at least one human culture that was being studied. And so this is a system where there's flexibility in the mating system. So there are so in humans there are many cultures where monogamy, at least serial monogamy, is the pattern, and that's been sort of codified into many of the now largest. So this is frequency across cultures, but not right, not weighted to population. Right. So there's some monogamous and polyandrous communities, especially in certain Arctic cultures, where you have multiple, where there'll be sort of two husbands and one wife. You have monogamy, which is sort of now the most common pattern by by population, but there are a number of cultures that have polygyny, some with a small fraction of plural wives, and some with a significant fraction, more than 20%. So the Dogon people in Mali were studied by Strassman and Gillespie, and they were trying to see whether the polygyny threshold model predictions were met. And so the prediction is that females should only sort of be the second wife for two males that had enough resources. For humans, it'd be sort of wealth, to be able to support children so that the reproductive success would match that of monogamous pairs, where presumably there might be fewer resources, but they're exclusively enjoyed by the offspring of one wife. So the prediction was actually that reproductive success should be the same in a society that has some plural wives and some monogamous pairing, because women should only be the second wife in in situations where it's above the threshold. So in fact, in monogamous pairs, fertility is significantly lower, but child mortality is much lower, and reproductive success of monogamous mothers is, the families with only a single wife, is significantly higher. In polygynous families, fertility is higher, but that's probably closely related to increased child mortality, right? So just like we saw in the Kung and the Hadza, if you have higher child mortality, that means, you know, shorter nursing periods, because I mean, most of that mortality happens when you're very young. So they're having more children, but much higher mortality, and reproductive success is lower. So this argues against the Orient's, you know, polygyny threshold model, and suggests this is a situation where, you know, sort of coercion is what's going on. Um, Interestingly, socially enforced monogamy is found more frequently in humans, you know, if you look like among proportionally in people, and even I think in the among culture comparison, unweighted, than in other mammals. And um, it's a little bit higher in primates as well. And there's interesting, you know, possible explanations. Um, and so that could be because of sort of group selection. So societies with polygyny are in some ways going to be inherently more conflicted because of the variation in reproductive success. Because if you have polygyny, that means you also have many more sort of unmarried men. That leads to sort of conflict, strife, jealousy, and perhaps you know, less success in, you know, cohesive activities like war that are needed for group success. Um, it's also possible that, like, if you have family assets like farms that are hard to split up, then smaller families might maximize sort of successful transfer among generations. And so we're going to be coming back to this later on in this lecture. So I wanted to talk about the demographic transition in humans. And actually, I'm not talking about primarily what's going on in the headlines these days. I don't know if you've been like watching and reading that much about the latest census came out, and there were many articles that I read with people really concerned about declining birth rates in the US. Um, and it's really interesting because the whole, like, whether we're going to talk about what the demographic transition is in a second, um, but um, your feelings about declining birth rates, I think, are um, strongly shaped, or should be strongly shaped, by whether you think there are enough or not enough or way too many people on the earth. And so, like, from my that's not the subject of this course, but when I teach general ecology, we talk about, you know, your human population, ecological footprint. We do a little in 106, and there's a lot of different ways of measuring sort of carrying capacity and ecological footprint. But by many of, and there is no single carrying capacity. If we all decide to be vegetarian and waste less food, the planet could support a far larger population than we have now. But if we enjoy eating like Americans, an omnivorous diet with lots of meat, then we are already way above the carrying capacity of the planet. And, you know, I'd probably say that the estimated loss of about 70% of birds, mammals, and fish in the last 50 years argues that we are past the carrying capacity, and in some ways we should expect it to be harder to sustain ourselves. So um, all I will say about whether it's good or bad that birth rates go down in the US is um, there are plenty of people in the world, and if we want a growing population to have a strong economy, which is what happens when you have lots of people moving into your country, Um, all we need to do is, you know, accept more immigrants. And since I would argue, there are far too many people already in the world, declining birth rates in wealthy nations are a great thing and will help make room um, for more people to come in. I feel like when people are worried about declining birth rates in the U.S., they're really just worried about um, the perceived shrinking numbers of people who look just like them. And so so there you go. So before we talk about demographic transition, that was just an introduction to say that um, as a sort of ecologist and someone who doesn't mind lots of different people in the country, declining birth rates are awesome because there are too many people in the world and some of them can come here. Okay, what is the demographic transition? Um, when people talk about it, they're actually talking about a pattern that has been repeated in many but not all countries and at different times, where first mortality rates declined and then fertility rates declined as well. So current population is actually, it's actually more like, sorry, it's more like 7.8 billion people. The current growth rate is, this is an old slide. I mean, I had a much more updated. It's actually 1.12% a year. Um, and that's actually still really fast growth. That means that if we continue at this rate in 55 years, now it's down to like 60 years, up to 60 years, there will be 16 billion people. So if you're thinking about like, are there enough people in the world and you think it's anywhere close? Well, what would twice that many people be? Um, but the other thing is that 1.2% annual growth, if you worked backwards and like shrank by 1.2% a year, you'd get down to Adam and Eve in 1300 years. What does that mean? That means that population growth is not constant. It's varied a lot over human history. And in fact, um, human population growth was incredibly slow for tens of thousands of years, and then it rocketed up um, in the 19th century. 18th, 19th century. There are several transitions. I'm going to go over them. So when I teach general ecology, we have a lot of fun trying to fit this curve. And the truth is, it's a trick question because you can't. It looks sort of like an exponential curve, but actually, if you fit the endpoints, it's going to have to look like this. If you fit most of the curve, which is this low thing, it never, it goes like that, right? It means that the exponent at any one moment, growth curve is exponential, but you look at the whole curve and the exponent has changed. Um, so from archaeological and historical records, it's been estimated that human doubling time, has changed drastically. So the genetic estimate of human population size was about 12,000, leaving Africa 50,000 years ago, right? And then population grew slowly. It was estimated to be about 5 million, 42,000 years later. In about the origin of city-states and local agriculture 8,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. And so the doubling time, local agriculture led to a, you know, a big jump up in population growth rates. The doubling time went from 40 to 300,000 years down to 1,400 to 3,000. global agriculture, think ships and grains and rum being transported between countries, 18th century, global exploration, global trade starting, population started to grow quite a bit faster. Then in the 20th century, we first had the public health revolution, clean water, antibiotics, vaccines, mostly vaccines and clean water. Um, and the doubling time shrinks from 87 years to 36 years. And then in 1970, that was when the Earth's population was growing the fastest, and people were really concerned about overpopulation. The doubling time was about 32 years. And but fertility had been declining in some countries starting in the 18th century, others in the 19th, others in the 20th, and the Earth's population is growing slower, quite a bit slower now than it was in 1970. The problem is it's so big that even a slow growth rate leads to a lot more sort of consumption and stuff. So when people talk about the demographic transition, they have very different sort of meanings. Sometimes it's described as like a an inevitable thing that societies are sort of driven to as they mature or get wealthier. Other times, people are trying to figure out just what the mechanism might be, and no really simple, clear explanation for it has yet, matches all the diversity of patterns that people see. But so the main thing to take from this chart is just that birth rates um, are declining all the way through the 20th century. Um, Death rates are declining as well, but birth rates are declining faster, or like starting in 1965 or 70. Um, the combination of birth rates and death rates peak, and then after that, it's slowing down. One thing that's interesting is that uh, these demographic transitions have occurred at different times and at different rates in different countries. So in the wealthier, earlier developing, colonizing countries, um, life expectancy more than doubled, but the birth rate less than halved. And it did that sometimes starting very early. Like demographic transition is often, credited to like access to good birth control. But in some countries, it started long before there was access to, really good birth control, the invention of, hormonal pills and stuff. Um, so um, you can organize demographic transitions into sort of early and late um, countries, just sort of defined to try to separate out the data. Early being countries where fertility rates start to fall before 1950, and late where they start to fall after. And then optimistically, there are some countries called pre-transitional where birth rates have not really fallen. Um, so these are just like two, representative examples of each. Sweden is a country where birth rates start to decline. It's hard to read the data, but sometime maybe in the early 1800s. And so, sorry, uh, these are the birth rates are starting to decline earlier, although there are some periods where they decline strong, faster than others. Death rates start to decline later in the early 19th century. In Mexico, it's different. Death rates decline first, and birth rates start to decline after 1950. But the other thing that you can see is that the decline in birth rates much faster in Mexico than it was in Sweden, right? So that's an important distinctive difference. So between early and late transition countries, birth rates start to decline later by definition in late, but they decline faster, and they decline after mortality rates decline in the in the early countries. They sometimes decline before. Um, so no one's ever been good at predicting where and when it happens. Um, it People didn't predict that the total Earth's population growth was going to be as low as it is now 50 years ago in 1970. It started in very different times in different countries. There are all sorts of hypotheses about education, access to birth control, religion, um, but then there are counterexamples to everything. Fell with low literacy in France and Belgium and Hungary, but it fell when literacy increased in England and Wales. Um, it fell primarily in rural France, but it fell in heavily industrializing England. In Sweden, in France, it's falling before infant mortality falls. In the late demographic transition countries, it's always falling quite a bit after mortality falls. So cause and effect, hard to suss out. Um, the late demographic transition countries, the declines in Asia and South America, were not predicted by certainly Western demographers, and they had not been seen universally. Um, and again, sometimes they're falling even with high infant mortality or with lower infant mortality, although both 10 and 5% are high levels of infant mortality, objectively, but um, relative to each other. Um, and um, Fertility declines have stopped in India and China, in China because of sort of government policies. Um, and also, we're going to talk about Iran in a second. That's a country that's trying to reverse a demographic transition. Um, so there are lots of reasonable hypotheses. Um, One sociologist, Handwerker's hypothesis, was that children shift from assets to burdens when they require more education away from home in order to be successful. So that's reasonable, and I think you should all stay in school as long as possible. Wait until situation's stable before having family. But there are lots of exceptions. So France, China, Bangladesh are all countries that experienced uh, demographic transitions, before, not associated with, you know, pressure to increase education in order to have job opportunities. It happened in rural France in the 19th century when there wasn't a college system to send kids to. So, like I said, there are a number of um, sort of interesting hypotheses, and probably different ones are more important in different countries. There used to be this idea that industrialization leads to reduced birth rate, but again, we have examples of rural farming societies that reduce birth rates as well. There's the idea that if you lower mortality, you will lower fertility, but we've seen that fertility sometimes falls before and sometimes after mortality declines, and parents can be more confident that some children will live. Um, we'll talk about about cultural evolution hypotheses, the examples of people imitating the examples of the most successful um, in society. The sort of behavioral ecologists emphasize costs and benefits of children. Um, we're going to probably sort of debunk that in a second. Um, Access to contraception, which is important but doesn't explain everything because it fell in countries before birth control was invented, really. Changes in religious beliefs. It's not in any simple way the countries with the lowest birth rates are primarily Catholic, although some of them are some of them are somewhat secular Catholic, but still probably have beliefs shaped by those religions. Um, and the other sort of example of sort of a theocratic society with rapidly shifting demography is Iran. So in the early 80s, like right after the revolution, there's a war going on with Iraq, and Khomeini wanted to increase population size as much as possible. My understanding is for competition with Iraq. And then after he died, I mean, the problem is many societies have and are being destabilized by large populations of, you know, young people without great job opportunities. And so the sort of religious and leaders in Iran wanted to encourage and did encourage family planning after Khomeini's death. And you can see the sharp decrease in younger cohorts um, in the 20 years or 15 years after um, um, Khomeini died and policies changed. Interestingly, like just like a couple years ago, or no, in 2020, the current supreme leader, I think it's Ali Khamenei, wants to reverse family planning programs in Iran, and they've stopped offering vasectomies at public hospitals and stuff. And he's saying he wants the population to go up from 80 million, where it is now, to 150 million. But the main take home of this slide is that, just because a country is one religion or another, or highly religious or highly secular, that's not a, that's not an easy explanation for birth rate and demographic patterns. Um, so behavioral ecologists have tried to understand, changing birth family size and historical family sizes by basically trying to do the same thing with human families as like David Lack and then others did with bird chick sizes, basically trying to figure out, maybe we're measuring the wrong fitness measure. Maybe it's good to have a smaller family because it will lead to somehow more successful offspring, and that will actually maximize like the number of grandchildren. And so this has been sort of tested mostly with historical data. Um, so it's possible that like humans are so K-selected that if we reduce family size and invest a lot more in offspring, that will increase the number of grandchildren, which is like David Lack's prediction, and predicts that some intermediate family size will lead to the largest number of grandchildren. And also, remember, think of the problem with correlational studies. The wealthiest families should be able to afford and should have more children because they can invest a lot in a larger number of children and have yet more grandchildren. And so this is quite testable. Look at historical records of how wealth correlates with fecundity. And in pre-industrial societies, the wealthier you were, the more children you had. And in early industrial revolution societies, that was the case as well. But that relationship breaks down in the 20th century, basically. So the wealthy had higher survival in 19th and 20th century Finland, and also had larger families. So understand that Finland's economy in the early 20th century is a lot like England's in the early, like the late 18th century or 19th century. So in basically almost pre-industrial Finland, and now they're incredible technology leaders. But there you go. Um, Wealthier having 7.4, middle class 6.3, the poor 4.6. So positive correlation with fecundity in pre-industrial Finland. However, in post-industrial societies, there's you know there's really no match. There's a positive correlation between fecundity and grandchildren. Remember the um, prediction from behavioral ecology was that we should see like an intermediate optimum, and there's no evidence of that at all. The more kids you have, the more grandchildren you have. And in post-demographic transition countries, fecundity is lower in the wealthier fraction of the population. Interestingly, that might be changing a little bit in the US since the last census. The relationship is still there, but it's flattening, which is an interesting, interesting even paper topic. So maybe cultural evolution is a better explanation for demographic transition. So we will be getting into the mechanisms of cultural evolution, but we have a lot of one of the sort of strong drivers of behavior in humans is prestige bias, bias towards imitation of successful individuals. And so it could just be that sort of the example of wealthy people with small families leads to imitation and spread of lower fecundity patterns. And that the initial smaller families is created by, very high costs of parental investment, like how much it costs to raise a Kennedy. And then that behavior is copied. So that's an interesting pattern. Interestingly, like within economic classes, there's a lot of evidence that cost of children and childbearing can have a big effect on human fecundity. So there, you can do studies of like different kinds of like tax policies and availability of free supported education or help with childcare. But those have effects, but they don't sort of erase necessarily the trend towards smaller families. So if you ask Dawkins, then he'll just say that the reduction in birth rates is just a maladaptive byproduct. We're just fooled by being able to have access to contraception. And so we have the proximate, urges that lead to mating, but it's been decoupled from reproduction. But the thing that's interesting is that it's really that sort of mistake hypothesis has kind of been disproven just by the observations of many countries reducing birth rates before reliable contraception was available. And the presence of some countries that have access to contraception that still have very high birth rates. And the reason why I stuck this little bullet in here, it's just an aside, which depends what your definition of adaptation is. And that was more what I already said, that our population is large enough already. Okay, so take homes from trying to use behavioral ecology to explain human behavior. It hasn't been that successful. It's kind of interesting. It's been very successful explaining lots of animal behaviors. the focus not on like cognitive mechanisms, but just measuring the costs and benefits of a behavior. Fitness, how does it energy intake or number of offspring or number of grandchildren, um, has been often successful in sort of understanding predicting animal behavior, and it's also been it's been sometimes successful in looking at humans, relating some things, like again like uh, children foraging, um, and like how that ends up affecting divorce and how that relates to ecological conditions. But that's like one of the sort of most successful examples. Behavioral ecologists are not that concerned with like mechanism and like what's the internal motivation of, um, or the like genetic or cognitive control of these behaviors. It's really just, does the economics match up? Does the fitness, um, costs and benefits seem to be balancing, and are do animals or people seem to be acting in their, sort of, genetic best interest? Um, so I think that's actually like a huge strength where in animals, where you can both measure fitness more easily, and sometimes the internal motivations are kind of a black box. I think humans, a lot of the interesting stuff is in the mechanisms, and that's what we're going to be talking about more later in the course. Um, and then the other thing is, um, behavioral ecology is definitely shaped by, um, individual level selection, right? And humans might be a little bit different because, we're going to be arguing, you're going to be reading more by Richardson and Boyd starting next week. Um, and that's going to be making strong arguments for group selection being more important for humans than for non-human animals. Okay, I want to talk for a second about what an adaptation is, because this came up in that Lalonde and Brown article. Um, so adaptations, there are some people like Stephen Jay Gould, and a co-author, Verba, forget their first name, um, that adaptations, calling something an adaptation should be strictly limited to traits that arose for the function that's currently increasing fitness. And that's probably like an unworkable, definition. I'm going to sort of talk about that in the next few slides. In Lalonde and Brown, they make a good distinction between current utility, is a trait adaptive now, versus original function. Why did it arise in the first place? And so they make a little four-part chart where this is, um, current utility, um, and then, versus, um, what was its origin. And then this is function. And so they're saying basically, um, that, um, there might be traits that are currently adaptive, and maybe they're being used for a new purpose. That would be an exaptation. Maybe they're currently adaptive just the way they were selected, in the past. Um, Dawkins is arguing that any unselfish behaviors in humans are dysfunctional byproducts, and they might have passed, um, of sort of modern society. And then evolutionary psych is, what we're about to talk about. Evolutionary psych, they're going to be arguing, that our traits now are not adaptive, but we have them because they were in the past. Okay, so let's talk about, menopause for a second, because it's been argued over, in all sort of corners of that little chart. Interestingly, so what is menopause? It's when, um, uh, females live for a significant period after, um, being fertile. And what you can see is like in primates, most non-human primates are fertile until or almost until death. So in chimps, lifespans 40 years, and they're fertile, at least in this figure, of like 38. Gibbons, macaques, it's similar. Humans have, you know, on average, 25, 30 years of, expected life after fertility. And so people have argued, puzzled over, you know, why this is. I want to point out, though, that even though menopause is like longest in humans among primates, it's not at all unique among mammals. Elephants and orcas are two species I know of that have um, lengthy post-reproductive lifespan. And um, those are both species where there's both a lot of, actually interestingly, like in, I mean, even in chimps, but in humans, there's a lot of grand parental care. But there's also a lot of, like, in elephants and orcas, there's, you know, studies showing that um, groups with elephant groups with old females were more likely to survive severe droughts in the 20th century. Like there's an important sort of like cultural knowledge value to having older experienced individuals in your group. Um, so one of the um, one of the questions when you're just trying to puzzle over the adaptive value of the trait is this sort of physiologically, is this reproduction ending early in the lifespan, or is this an extension of the lifespan past um, what would have been the expected for like body size, reproductive age? Um, so there's there have been like multiple hypotheses in terms of what's the evolutionary mechanism behind menopause. One is that there could be a mutation selection balance. Ideas that there's um, selection is kind of strongest on um, early fecundity, because the earlier you can start reproducing, basically the faster the growth rate of that population or that gene or trait. And its selection on fecundity is weaker at higher at older ages, and this is related to this other idea of like antagonistic pleiotropy, the idea that like a trait that might have a cost later in life but a benefit earlier in life is going to be um, is going to be might be favored. Um, but then there's also the trying to measure the positive benefits of grandmothering, like what are the values of having um, you know, care from not just your parents, but also um, from grandparents, from grandmothers, and that would those benefits would favor elongation of lifespan past reproduction. So this would actually still be this would be a really good paper topic, because it's still something that people are working on. Um, so I actually would argue that this idea of exaptations is not actually a useful concept. Gould got a lot of sort of hay out of it. But when you think about how natural selection works, it is always going to be working on sort of a suite of traits that exist at one time. Every adaptation arises as modifications of structures that had a previous function. So, like for example, the eye, it wasn't that eyes were necessarily eyes couldn't have been originally favored for, you know, accurate vision, um, but light sensing organs that allowed animals, or single cells even, to like adjust the timing of their activity, um, or perhaps avoid predation, were favored. And in some ways, every succeeding modification that leads up to, eyes with lenses that can focus are, modifications of structures that had a previous function. You see that like in intro bio, you see that when you're looking at the evolution of gene trees, and you see like, a molecule that used to help muscle cells hold on to oxygen eventually becomes a molecule that carries oxygen in the blood to muscles, and it's, a copy of that gene is now changed and altered its function. Um, so I would actually say that like this obsession with like trying to find out what the original function of every trait is not necessarily as useful as much as, whether there's genetic variation for the trait now, what are the fitness costs and benefits of the trait. Okay. Um, so that brings us to evolutionary psychology, which has a huge focus on um, evolved innate psychological mechanisms. Basically, the idea is that current human behavior is the often no longer adaptive legacy of previously adaptive shortcuts. So in Cosmides and 2B's word, it's, modern skulls has a Stone Age mind. And so they have this idea that our behavior is like human nature is kind of this fixed thing that evolved in some idealized Pleistocene environment of evolutionary adaptedness. Um, and so that's what they're arguing. Um, it's um, it's kind of the human extension of a school of animal behavior called cognitive ecology, which I'm a little shocked to see that it's the end of our class. Um, I will start off next week talking about cognitive ecology because I can't just finish this in 5 minutes. But it's basically, there have been some really nice studies showing how the cognitive abilities, counting, memory, spatial learning, mostly spatial learning, often vary among species with different ecological challenges. So we're gonna talk about that starting next week. Okay, take a look at the paper topics. Write to me with ideas for paper topics, and I'm gonna probably stop recording, but I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes and take any questions. Yeah, we can get some review questions. Um, I I need to revise them and figure out how they match what we've actually spoken. But yeah, I've got a list of about 40 questions.